All right. My name is Dr. Josh Waltman. I'm here for Living Word Press. We have this new series called Pastors, Authors, and Teachers, where we're going to do an interview every so often, I should say, an interview. And in this particular case, our guest is all three of those things: a pastor, author, and a teacher. And maybe we could say a scholar as well. We certainly could say a scholar as well. Dr. Erbey Valdez. And Dr. Erbey Valdez, just to kind of give you a quick intro to him. He is a senior pastor at New Spirit Church in San Antonio, Texas. Holds multiple degrees. Man, you got a degree for like every day of the year, right? I mean, goodness gracious. Let's see, a Master's of Education, Master of Theological Studies, Master of Divinity, Master of Theology, and a PhD in New Testament Biblical Studies from Columbia International University. He's got his hand in a lot of pots here. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Valdez.
Absolutely. The privilege is mine, brother.
Yeah, man. So look, you wrote this book, The Voices of the Fourth Gospel, Characters in an Emerging Christian Community. It's an excellent book. I was able to get into it and sort of dive in here. I'm really excited for this interview and kind of talking about this book. And hopefully you can give us some info on how to get it later on in the interview here. But first and foremost, the title is The Voices of the Fourth Gospel. I thought John was the voice of the fourth gospel. What is this all about?
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you again for the invitation. And this work began really while I was doing my dissertation at Columbia International, and so much of the work that you see in this book was based on my research that I did for my dissertation there, the PhD work at Columbia International, and when I began to examine, it began with an examination of the characters of the fourth gospel. And when I began to look at each one of those in their own context, I began to realize that each one of them had a unique voice. And when I say voice, I mean a socio-cultural voice for their time. And what I mean by that is, I believe that when John, who is, of course, I believe John of Zebedee, the author of the gospel, but we do see elements of its authorship, especially when we look at chapter 21 and other portions where maybe even after his passing, that maybe the compilation and the putting together of the gospel, maybe primary disciples that worked under him, began to see the importance of some of these characters as relevant for their time. If we take the standard view that the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written somewhere in between, let's say between the 40s to the 70s, somewhere within that period of time, and that's kind of the consensus view. Not to get into debates about the dating of the synoptics, that would put the fourth gospel about 20 to 25 years after the writing of the synoptics. And that's interesting because John of Zebedee, being the only disciple who didn't suffer death through martyrdom, got to live to a ripe old age, was privileged to see the church form into an emerging community at the end of the first century. And what I saw was that this church here, primarily, if we accept the view that most people believe that the fourth gospel was written in the community of Ephesus, that there were some real issues happening, not only there, but throughout the church communities that were relevant for their time, that maybe were not as prevalent or present during the time of the writing of the synoptics. So when I say the voices of the fourth gospel, I look at these characters each having a unique voice that they could offer for the readership at the end of the first century, that were needing to hear instruction and understanding of how to live out their faith, really in an ever-changing world. 25 years, let's just say more or less, after the writing of the synoptics.
Okay, so we've got different voices or characters. Is that an accurate way to put this?
Yes.
So who would be just as an example, maybe you don't need to go through all of them, but what would be an example of a character or a voice that would be speaking into this Johannine community?
Sure. So one of the things that I tackle, and I really devote the first two chapters in this book, are the historicity, the historical relevance of these characters, because when scholars began to look at the fourth gospel, they began to see something totally different than the other gospels. They call it the maverick gospel, or the gospel that's just completely unique than them, and saying something's why are these characters so different? Why is, for example, Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, why are they present here, but they weren't present in the synoptics? Why is, for example, Jesus presented in a much more human way, but also especially in a divine way? I mean, we look at, for example, Luke presenting and Matthew presenting the genealogy of Jesus. For example, Matthew going back to Abraham, but we see Luke going back to Adam. But John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we see this much greater development of Christ's character. And people would look at that and say, well, can we still count this as historical? And to give you an example, we look at John the Baptist. So if I may, let me just read to you from the prologue. In John chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, we look at one of the first things that John says about John the Baptist, which is one of my character case studies. And it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. So it's interesting that the first thing that John describes about John the Baptist is who he is not, and which is, of course, not the Messiah. Well, I began to explore, well, why is that the case? And I realized that at the time of the writing of the fourth gospel, if we take it, give or take, about 90 to 95 AD, there was a movement that we have evidence to support of a developing in that area, especially of John the Baptist being viewed as the Messiah and not Jesus. And when we see this community that began to develop this, I could see a very important need to represent John the Baptist, not as what the culture had begun to develop or began to formulate, but to say, no, let's keep these characters within their correct presentation. So not only do I present and argue that these characters are historical, but I think that John was trying to preserve their historicity, because I think that in culture today, especially, it's easy to make people more grandiose than what they should be. We look at characters, even modern characters like Elvis Presley or John Wayne, and we make them, as time goes by, they become more grandiose.
Justin Bieber.
Justin Bieber, mega icon. And I look at what John was doing with these characters, and he's saying, "Whoa, wait a minute! John was not some divine figure. He was the one elected to bring in and usher in the voice of Jesus. So in him, I characterize him as the voice of the Old Testament prophets. And John presents him as he is the gateway. He is the bridge between the Old Testament and the New, affirming that Jesus is the Son of God. But to make him bigger than Jesus was, of course, a terrible error in their interpretation of who John was. Well, you compare that, for example, to Luke's presentation, because Luke does present the birth of Jesus in a divine way. The angel visits Mary, and Mary has this incredible encounter, and is told that her son's going to be the Messiah. But also in Luke's presentation, you see Zacchaeus, the father of John the Baptist, and Elizabeth. So it's almost like they're intertwined. Well, it's not that Luke isn't telling the truth. It's that at that time, it was important to present both of their ministries as necessary to establishing the identity of Jesus. But somehow along the way, over the next 25, 30 years, something had gone wrong to where people were beginning to see John the Baptist more than what he should have been. So he's a perfect example of almost like a historical corrective that was presented in his gospel.
Yeah, that's good. So John is addressing some of the issues that had cropped up in the years following, say, the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And these are theological problems in the early church, or at least that are circulating in culture. And so John is correcting those issues, it sounds like, is kind of what you're getting at.
Yes, I think that when you look at new characters, they maybe they weren't as necessary prevalent at that time, but now they were very necessary. And then when you look at characters that were present in the synoptics, yes, I think that there were some things that needed to be clarified. Judas is another one. Judas had taken on almost I guess you could say, a tragic hero kind of sense in some of the cultures, what we see, especially in some of the other writings. So
Yeah.
to the point to where even you see some of that manifest in what was later discovered in this Gospel of Judas that the Gnostics had begun to write about. And so John was dealing with real issues at that time, heresies, things that were leading people astray. And I think that was a primary motive for the writing of the fourth gospel. It would make sense to me that it would be different than the synoptics if it was written that far removed from the synoptics, because why else be motivated to write a gospel if it's just going to repeat what was already established? So
Right.
John had the privilege of reading the synoptics and then seeing the culture of the church form, and then being able to offer through these characters, new characters, especially like Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, in ways that I think could speak to his community at that time, although still historical.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, this may be taking us a little too far afield, but just kind of curious where you'd go with this. And for the readers or the viewers, the listeners that maybe are less in tune with, say, biblical studies as a piece of scholarship, but there are those that would say that the fourth gospel, because it is so different, and because it seems to be driven more by specific, theology, that essentially this is the church fabricating myth. I think about the Bart Ehrman scholarship and vein of scholarship that's out there that want to say, look, this is so different. The deity of Christ is so on full display and is so explicitly referenced in the fourth gospel that there's no way that that's comparable or incongruent or congruent with the synoptics. What would you say to something like that? That, like Ehrman would say, that this is just John creating myth or something like that to help increase the influence of Christianity around the Roman Empire.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Let me read to you a portion of my book, just a real quick couple of sentences. On page 56, I write this. One of the primary reasons for why readers have wrestled with the historicity of the fourth gospel is because, from the earliest traditions, the synoptics have served as the historical gauge by which it has been measured, which means everything was compared to them. But I go on to say this. Moreover, the fourth gospel fortifies the synoptics by responding to contemporary efforts to deviate from or subvert them. So, you're exactly right. I think that New Testament scholars, and especially more liberal scholars such as Bart Ehrman, who have challenged the historical nature of the text, I would answer by saying this. First of all, John of Zebedee was a direct eyewitness, and people forget he walked with Jesus from day one and through, was able to be a direct eyewitness to the things that were done. And there's evidence there that when we look at and I'm borrowing from scholars such as D.A. Carson and Paul Anderson out there, who and Kostenberger, another one, who were able to demonstrate that there are elements of the fourth gospel that are not new to that time. John must have been teaching this from day one after the resurrection, and much of what we see here is as old, or I don't even want to use the word old, but as reliable, I guess you could say, as the synoptics. And it would make sense. I mean, John had taken notes. John was teaching and preaching. He must have been in Ephesus for at least 25, 35 years. And so many of his congregation had gotten to know the characters he had taught and preached on. And so to the church at Ephesus, it was common knowledge. These were the people that John not only wrote about and preached about, but that he saw himself. He heard and witnessed himself. He was there. For example, when we look at the crucifixion, if it wasn't for the fourth gospel, we would think that all of the disciples had abandoned Jesus at the cross. But lo and behold, there's the beloved disciple standing there with Mary, of course, which Jesus, commissions him to take care of, and he accepts that. But we see other characters such as Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. And so John is offering a perspective of the same events, and yet he's writing not only to contemporaries there at that time, but also to those who were hostile to the gospel. And yet we find no evidence of people speaking out. Wait a minute, John, that's not true. This is what I see. So to me, the silence is golden, because John was writing of issues that he himself directly witnessed, that he was privy to. Bart Ehrman wasn't there. I wasn't there. You weren't there.
Right.
But John of Zebedee could say he was there and was writing of things that he himself witnessed.
That's something that I enjoyed about the case studies. I mean, because, what I'm hearing you say is that the earliest Christology was the highest Christology, that their understanding of Christ from very early on in church history, all the way back to, the disciples that walked with him, they understood it from early on. This wasn't a fabrication of the church within, say, the first century or the early second century. And one of the reasons I like the book is that your case studies really help to pinpoint that. Like he's presenting a high Christology, but with characters that people knew and that were fundamental to the other synoptic stories. This is all speaking to a historical account.
Yes.
And I don't know, would you say that that the fourth gospel is it a Greco-Roman biography? Is that kind of what we're looking at, or?
Yeah, because my approach and the technical academic term of the strategy or the technique that I used, the style, was a study from a socio-rhetorical perspective. And what I mean by that is socio, of course, meaning socio-cultural, the background, understanding the cultural background, but the rhetorical meaning, yes, the Greco-Roman, the classical rhetorical structure. Well, why did I do that? Because I think that for too long, narratologists or literary scholars really focused on the story, but at the expense of its historical validity. But then historians, people that were like textual critics, form critics, they would approach it, but then also sacrificing the narrative element of it. And I thought, wait a minute, no, there has to be a fusion between the two, and understanding that here is a story that is told, but it's really an eyewitness testimony. So I think that your description of Greco-Roman biography is consistent with that. And but there's nothing like the Gospels. That's the amazing thing. It's almost like they're a genre all on their own, which is why I love preaching out of this. Is like the word is life, right? And these characters, and one of the things that I say about this, because characters, when you look at historically, how do people approach characters, right? They'll say, well, they're representatives of things, or they're symbols of things, or they're icons of this. But the problem with all of those descriptions is they're so flat and dead on the page. They stay right there. But I say, no, they're voices. They're living and active. Even to us today, these characters speak to us. And we're not so far removed from that. And if I may, one example, for example, is Nicodemus. People say, well, why would he share Nicodemus? Well, really, and what I describe him is, he's the voice of Jewish hope. Here was this hardcore, fundamentalist Pharisee, but he saw something different in Jesus. And we see 3 different episodes throughout the Gospel of John. 3 different times he's presented. Once at the beginning of his ministry, another time in chapter 7, then again at the end in his burial. But what you see is a developing character. You see one who doesn't get it at first. He knows that he's sent by God, but he doesn't understand what it means to be born again. And Jesus kind of rebukes him and challenges him really to really rethink the way he's thought things. And then you see in chapter 7, there's kind of a changing element. And then finally at the end, there he is, standing for all to see that he's there. He brings an amount of spice to bury him that leaves no doubt that amount is only reserved for someone of royalty, somebody who is of such renown that he's deserving of such a royal burial. And he's telling everyone, this was the King of Kings. And I thought, wow, here is the evidence that people can change. And to me, it's motivational and it's inspiring even today. And I think that's what John's purpose was, to show these people who had real life encounters with Jesus, and they were never the same after that. And who else can we say except for Christ as being one who changes us? And hopefully, Lord willing, right, for those who really encounter him, they'll say, I've never been the same since that. And I think that that's what these characters reveal.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's almost like the guy who's giving I hate to use this example, and I know I'm going to instantly lose all my scholarly credibility right now. Okay, but that's all right. Yes, I like Bill and Ted's Most Excellent Adventure. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that movie, but in that movie, they actually bring the historical figures with them to the stage and say, "Hey, here's Aristotle. Tell the story. Here's such and such. Here's the guy from history. Tell the story as part of their report." And it's almost like John is doing that. He's got a theological agenda. Certainly, he's trying. He's arguing. He's presenting his case. He's making an argument throughout the book, but he's using the voices of these other characters as sort of proof positive, as argumentation on his behalf. It's kind of
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah, no, I love that. I love that analogy. I'm probably going to steal that from you now. Uh, that's gnarly, dude. That's exactly right. I think Bill and Ted's example there really reveals that. Yeah, if we could bring those people back and let them each speak in their own voice of what they encountered,
Yeah.
it would be amazing. The Samaritan woman. How is it that chapter 3, John presents Nicodemus, and then immediately in chapter 4, here's this great scholar of Israel, and he can't get it, and yet here's this Samaritan woman, a woman in that context, in that cultural setting, by all regards, would be somebody that would be disregarded as somebody that's unimportant, somebody who is not relevant to the story of God's salvation. And Jesus says, no, far be it. In fact, she's the one that's able to get it. And to me, there's a real meaning there. And what is it? And the meaning is this, that even though at the beginning, Jesus tells her, you Samaritans, you worship what you do not know. Yet she's seeking wholeheartedly. She wants to know. And it's that desire to know that Jesus is able to really bless. And that's true today. That if anybody, for me as a pastor, somebody walking in, you can see people walking in with all their credentials, all their background, all of their training, all of their degrees or whatever, and their pedigree. But yet, if their heart is hardened, and a lot of times those things can get in the way. Yet you have somebody who has very little training, but comes in with the heart that's open to receive. And I think that that's the voice for the Samaritan woman, whom I describe as the voice of Samaritan hope. A culture that, by all regards, had been shunned, which most of us who are aware of the biblical story, the Jews despised the Samaritans. They avoided the Samaritans, and Jesus says, "No, to that place I will go. That there's no place too far removed from me." And so, in these characters, I really see John bringing them forth. And I say this in the book: they were a necessity for the emerging church at that time. I think that they were so necessary for the people that were coming into faith. And I really believe they're more than necessary today. They are absolutely a necessity. And these are the things that I think that should be not only written and published about, but they should be preached from the pulpit.
Yeah, man, John was brilliant as a writer. Goodness gracious. I mean, it helps when you're inspired by the Holy Spirit, but I'm just saying he was certainly brilliant. It's incredible. Hey, one thing I was going to ask you. So in the book, you talk about sort of the differences, because we were talking about case studies here, but there's also this reference to the difference between, say, the Son of God and the Son of Man, and the way that John, he's the beloved disciple. Would you say that, like, he's giving us sort of his own voice there by referring to him as Son of God versus Son of Man?
Yeah, my daughter, she actually brought up a really good question. She said, "Dad, if John of Zebedee was as humble as you say, he was more of the quiet character, why would he refer to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved?" Right. And in my book, one of the things that I proposed was, even though the source and the substance of the gospel belongs to John of Zebedee, years and years of notes and teachings and so forth, the actual composition and the putting together of the gospel, the final product, I believe, was a direct disciple of John. And we really don't know that the idea of the authorship, and how do you define author, right? All of the substance, everything that we read about is the direct eyewitness written testimony of John of Zebedee. I have little doubt of that, even though that's a big debate, right? But that's what I stand by. And one of the biggest reasons why I say that is because in the fourth gospel, John of Zebedee is not even mentioned. It's he's hardly mentioned. I mean, only maybe in a couple of spots, but really he's not. And so you would have to explain to me how one of the primary disciples, one of the inner three, right, John, James, and Peter, why otherwise he would not be mentioned if he's not the beloved disciple. So I believe he was given this title, this understanding, because at the time when the fourth gospel was written, this was the tradition of the Ephesian church. When we look at the other three gospels, they were written from other areas, and I feel like the church there in Ephesus said, "Wait a minute, we have stories that John has left us, and I think that we would do him a grave injustice if we didn't write these things down and let other people know." It's almost like the authoritative voice of the Ephesian church through what John of Zebedee's preaching and teaching was. And one of those that's really prevalent is in the way he presents Jesus, as you referred. He speaks to him as Son of God and as Son of Man, which are two areas in which I describe Jesus. Well, why is that? Some people look and see clearly that John elevates the divinity of Jesus in ways that the other gospels do not, which is clearly true. He's here, especially in the prologue, he's defined as eternal, coexisting with God the Father. He's clearly developed as the Son of God in his own unique role. He is of the same substance of God, but at the same time, he has a unique function and a unique identity as the Son of God, as a second member of the Trinity. And so when we look at that, we say, okay, so John maybe is elevating this, but at the same time, you look at his humanity. In John's gospel, he weeps, he cries. We see much more clarity in his suffering, especially on the cross. We wouldn't have known that he would have been, the spear on his side and the blood and the water that flows. So there's equally an emphasis on the humanity of Jesus. So you can't really ignore either one. And I think what's happening here is John, again, is not only presenting Jesus in this full sense, but if he's really a historical corrective, at that time, there were two thoughts that were emerging. That was Docetism, which was this denial of his humanity. And John wanted to say, no, wait a minute, don't forget that Jesus was as human as we are. He suffered fully. He was fully human, but he was also fully divine. And I think that throughout history, when we look at the pendulum of the theology of when we look at Christology, let's say, the pendulum oftentimes would not center on both a perfect balance between the two, but oftentimes putting too much emphasis on one or the other. And I think that the fourth gospel is saying you cannot overemphasize one over the other. It is equally important to understand that Jesus was as fully human as he was divine, for only a human could do what needed to be done to redeem us, because humanity had to save itself, but humanity couldn't in its sinfulness. So humanity had to save itself. So Jesus, being fully human, was essential to that perfect sacrifice. But at the same time, only God could do it because it had to be a perfect sacrifice. And so I see John putting that perfect balance in those two characterizations in his gospel.
Yeah, and certainly that comes up in Chalcedon later on in church history, but that's great. So, I mean, it almost sounds like John is providing, you're saying it provides the perfect balance that sets the stage for, say, a hypostatic union at Chalcedon and so forth.
Yeah, and I wish that when we really look at the description of Jesus, and even in the church today, it's easy to get away from those two things. And even for me as a pastor, I have to be careful never to neglect either side of Jesus, who even today it's still fully human and fully divine. And people forget, Jesus ascended to heaven, but his humanity wasn't gone. He's forever the perfect human, the perfect Son of God, the one who is the mediator between humanity and God the Father. And so I think that John emphasizes that and the need to show that Jesus in his presentation to the world and his revelation in both of those elements, that if we ever neglected one, we would suffer in our understanding and our fullness of who Christ is. So Christology absolutely needs those two elements.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. This has been great. Here's a question for you. I didn't include it on any sort of list or anything, but I did want to ask you. So this again is the book for all of the viewers out there, the Voices of the Fourth Gospel. Um, Obviously, this is meant, at least in part, for a scholarly audience. It came out through Peter Lang, the publisher there. But why might someone in the church who maybe isn't a scholar, why should they pick this up?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I really worked on, I did a lot of work to transition it over into its book form after after I completed the dissertation. But I present it in a way that it's easier to read. I've had several folks who are not in the academic world read it and give me their honest opinion, and what they told me was, you have references, lots of references to the Greek and a lot of the technical things. He goes, but even when I finish the chapters or whatever, I understand it fully. I appreciate it in its context. And even though I may not be, a person says to me, even though I may not be fluent in Greek or Hebrew, or although I may not be familiar with some of the more critical methods, I can still appreciate the message. And I really do emphasize the narrative and the narratological elements of John's gospel, so that people can appreciate the story, because I didn't want to pick the story apart to the point to where the story was lost. So I would say to those people out there that if you're serious about growing in Christ, if maybe you're a Sunday school teacher, a preacher out there, a pastor, but even if you're just a layman who is just wanting to grow in the faith, I think this book will really help you to understand elements of these important characters that John brings forth in a way that still speaks to us today, and allows us to understand the personal encounters that people had were unique, that they were real. And oftentimes we read the stories and we're so far removed from it, right? That was 2,000 years ago across that ocean, to a culture and a people I will never understand. But man, when you begin to read these people as real people who were dealing with real issues, who were really hurting, who were looking for something, man, there's something beautiful in that. And I think that the majesty in all of the gospels, but especially in John's gospel, really comes forth when we read it with those eyes. And I think that this book helps with that.
Yeah, and just to echo what you're saying for our viewers here, it's a very readable book, and yes, it's got elements of scholarship in it, but honestly, it's very well written. It's very understandable. You're not going to get lost in the details. You're going to probably, if you're not familiar with some of the scholarship when it comes to the Book of John, yeah, okay, some of this might be kind of new to you, but you do a great job of introducing even someone who's kind of picking it up for the first time. You kind of bring them along, and I'd say, yeah, for someone that's in the church, especially a pastor, or just maybe someone that's really wanting to dive into the background of the Gospel of John, this is a great book. I'd highly commend it. So, just real quick, if people want to pick this thing up, where do they need to go? Where is it available?
Well, it's available on all outlets. Amazon is probably most people's go-to, but it's available on Barnes and Noble. It's Google, but of course, Peter Lang's website. You can just Google Peter Lang and either put Voices of the Fourth Gospel. You can put my name, Erbey Valdez, and the book will pop right up. I believe that the pricing is probably most competitive on the Peter Lang website, but of course, for lots of folks who have their Amazon accounts, it's as easy as a couple of clicks. But it's already immediately available. It's part of. I was blessed that they informed me that this book was accepted as part of their Studies in Biblical Literature series, and so I would encourage you, if you do go out there to look for the book, check out some of the other books that are out there. There's some amazing work that's being put out there. Strong, good exegesis. People who are really committing their life to bringing forth the elements of biblical studies. And so, you went back to saying, is it too complicated? I don't think I'm that smart. I don't think I'm so smart that I complicate things. But I think that God's word speaks for itself. It's profound enough that I don't need to do anything other than just say what God says.
Amen. Speaking of that, if there are any viewers that are interested in maybe getting in contact with you, or I think it's pretty obvious to the viewer that you're a preacher, and that you can sort of break things down and really do justice to the text in that way. If they want to kind of follow what you're doing in ministry or get in contact with you in terms of ministry, how might they do that?
Yeah, so we are again with New Spirit Church in San Antonio, Texas. So we have a Facebook page there. If you ever want to watch us, we have all of our studies, and all of my sermons are there. Also, they're posted on YouTube. So if you have a YouTube account, find New Spirit Ministries, and you'll find our studies are on there. All of my sermons are on there. I do weekly devotionals as well, and I encourage you, if you want to just get connected with us that way. It'll be easy, and you'll be blessed for what I think are some of we have some great folks there at the church as well who are doing amazing work, and I think when we put ourselves in that world and just are able to feed ourselves with the word in all kinds of different forms, we just naturally going to grow. And so I do encourage you. So New Spirit Ministries on YouTube, or find us on Facebook.
Amen. Well, brother, thank you so much for joining us. This was really a blessing to me. I know it is to our viewers as well, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, and may God bless you in your work, because I know you're doing some very important work in training the future teachers and pastors out there who will be preaching God's word. So may God bless you.
Well, thanks, man. We'll see y'all later.
All right.